share my screen so that everyone can see the agenda. So we were hoping to have a conversation about, after these 3 talks, to talk about what are the essential variables that are needed to close the gaps on developing a carbon budget. I think that we touched on that a little bit in terms of year-round observations and particularly cold period observations, but if anyone wants to chime in and speak to that.
I was just interested, a couple of questions to Chip. Chip, I like your presentation, particularly the slide that showed the comparison between the flux tower measurements and the atmospheric aircraft measurements. So I guess I wonder if you could talk to that a little bit more. I mean, when we look at these flux towers, they integrate 100 meters or something along those lines, we actually find differences in different habitats. And so do you just think that by flying over this, you're sort of integrating everything together? And I found that result striking. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so Will, you bring up a very good point where if you were to put, say in the Barrow area, if you were to put flux towers in a drained lake bed or right next to, right on top of, say, a polygonal tundra piece or near a dried out place, you would probably get 3 very, very different sets of fluxes. What we were, number one, we didn't know how well with the comparison of the aircraft measurements with the flux tower data would work. And in fact, that they even show up on the same plot on the same scale is pretty remarkable to us. And what we think we're seeing is as you say, the kind of averaging together of the collective flux tower data within their ranges and relative uncertainties with the aircraft measurements. And so this gives us a nice way of moving forward. One of the discussions that I've had with Stan Luschlager and others in the NG project for quite a while is, have they picked possibly the worst place in all of the North Slope to localize the NG experiment, because it's really challenging to see how Barrow on the end of the peninsula scales across the rest of the North Slope. And so there's a great opportunity for us there to take all of the process level studies that they've done and compare them to what you see across the rest of the Arctic coastal plain, into the foothills, and certainly into the uplands in places like Tuluik and Nunavut, where Eugenie has her flux towers. So there's lots of good testing and observation that can be done just in Alaska. And then there's the question of how do we scale then across into the Mackenzie Delta or into the Northwest Territories of Canada, let alone what they've been doing in Siberia. And so as you can begin looking at these different spatial scale questions, there are also commensurate temporal scale questions that one can address. And the reason that I was suggesting a tiered observing system, or an observing system that's made up of multiple different components, is because no one in situ, ground-based, or atmospheric measurement, or satellite measurement, or airborne measurement is going to get you all of the pieces of information that are needed. And there are different components of the system that will provide us different insights and different constraints as we begin to assemble and synthesize information about the Pan-Arctic carbon budget.
Okay, so that's a great summary. Thanks. So given that, what are we missing? In other words, do we need greater spatial coverage? Do we have the habitats generally covered at the level we need? Do we need more temporal coverage? We've got flux towers that are out there, year round. Do we need to move outside of Alaska? I mean, is Alaska representative of the rest of the Pan-Arctic? Where do you think we need to go?
So the answer to your question, I will put back to you, depends on which questions one asks.
Sure.
Are you asking for a broad scale Pan-Arctic budget where we're trying to close a geographic region from, say, 50 to 90 north? Are you asking, do we understand the processes that drive the temporal onset of carbon uptake in different portions of the boreal forest or the Arctic tundra in Siberia versus North America, for instance. There would be slightly different versions of the observing system or the emphasis that one would have depending on which specific questions are being asked. A thing that we're kind of skirting around right now, Dave mentioned it a little bit, is the impact of the Arctic Ocean and decreased sea ice cover on what one will experience both in the terrestrial processes, but from the atmospheric measurement perspective, it's all what is underneath the atmosphere. And to really get a good handle on the terrestrial carbon budget and how it might be changing in space, time, magnitude, et cetera, we really do need to begin to understand much better the Arctic Ocean carbon budget, how things like acidification, longer exposure of the water to the atmosphere for exchange, et cetera, how that's beginning to impact things. And so, again, we get back to the point that Dave and Larry Hintzman and others have been making for many years now, which is the Arctic as a system, and it really is largely inseparable, and we need to address all of the different components if we're going to have a true understanding of what's going on in any individual component.
Sure. And, AON and other programs provide, mechanisms for doing some of that. I mean, as you just heard, the Flux Tower stuff is funded by AON, but AON also funds the Grand Prix, who is looking at just that issue and the effect of, high ice and low ice seasons on the flux of carbon between the ocean and the atmosphere, as well as acidification and fluxes to deeper water, et cetera. So there's that opportunity to do that. I don't see, everybody realizes that. Unfortunately, I don't see enough of that synergy going on. Maybe it's going on, I don't know about it. But you articulated well, and Larry's been doing it for a long time, the need to do that, but I don't see the systems level approaches that I think, we at NSF would like to see in just in the community in general. So do you have any thoughts on how one might go about connecting those pieces?
Hey, maybe I'll jump in.
So let's use the Great Rivers Observatory. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, that was a question to Chip, but I would point out that the methane workshop that Dave led, that was part of the Permafrost Carbon Network, specifically was linking together ocean, coastal, terrestrial groups trying to do this system level thinking. It's a big challenge, of course, to do any activity that was focused just on methane by itself, but I think identifying kind of key elements of the carbon cycle. In this case, it was methane. I think that's one step forward because you're taking people from different science backgrounds and trying to have them communicate. So maybe narrowing down the subject, even from Arctic carbon balance, helped in that regard. I thought there was a lot of good discussion within this methane workshop across these communities. But even so, as Dave McGuire could attest, we had these workshop reports and highlighted things, and not every community was completely happy with some of the outcomes. And I think that's partly just a communication issue. And you can see there's just these stumbling blocks even when scientists from different communities speak to that. And one thing I would say, Will, in response to your kind of big question, which Chip answered in terms of what do we know and what don't we know. And I think, we just heard some tremendous work going on about the carbon budget. And I would say, from my perspective, fluxes, with the uncertainties that we know about are getting lots of attention, as they should. But we have to also step back and think about, what climate feedbacks in the carbon cycle has to do with is changing pool sizes. And we largely focus on fluxes as being the mechanisms when that happens. But I think to some degree we forget about actually measuring the pools and repeat measuring of them. And so there's a lot of new work, especially on biomass, I think, with the Above project, looking at vegetation, but ultimately, the big carbon pools below ground, we have through the permafrost carbon network kind of identified maps of soil carbon, where is the carbon, where it exists, but actually what you want to know is how that changes through time. Now that has a lot of its own technical challenges, but I think it's something we should be working on a lot more than we are. And if we compare that to kind of the work that's going on in fluxes, I would call sort of changes in stocks being sort of an underappreciated area of research.
Yeah, well, that's why I actually looked at that when I broke out the NSF projects. I had whatever I called it, storage was where I was going with that.
Well, storage, I think, is, so that probably every site says, yeah, we characterize the stock once. But what we're actually, the question is, is this changing through time? And I'm not going to go into the technical problems with that, but I would guess if you looked at your storage proposals, there could be 0 of them that are trying to track changes in soil carbon through time. Although I don't know what, you didn't list the title, so I can't say that for sure.
There were 83 of them, so.
I'd like to chime in with a question on that point. Some of the things I was flagging through this discussion were some of the kind of base requirements, like Dave had mentioned this methane-centric land cover database. And then at the Finland workshop that Eugenie had mentioned, there was also this emphasis that, in this world of things that we need to track, as Ted mentioned, the fluxes and then the pools. It also seems like there's a gap around the quality and the maybe even tracking the changes in land cover. Are those, can you speak to those a little bit more, and specifically what would be a methane-centric land cover database that couldn't avail itself of a more generically oriented land cover database?
Yeah, maybe I could speak to that last question. This is Dave McGuire. So part of the problems is with most land cover databases is they tend to focus on upland types. They're very good at distinguishing conifer trees from deciduous trees, from upland tundra. What they haven't been very good about is sort of telling us explicitly, well, what are collapsed scar bogs, what are collapsed scar fens, high versus low center polygons, and various thermokarst features that are characteristic of wetlands and permafrost regions, and then the added complication of separating out lakes from wetlands, and shallow lakes versus deeper lakes, for example. And so that this has been a stumbling block for years and years, and the land cover community really hasn't been able to quite step up to the plate to provide the methane community with what it needs. And so the effort that at least the search methane synthesis effort has produced is to at least to develop something that is specifically focused on being able to scale methane across the landscape from bottom-up measurements, and to avoid this double accounting that you often get into with respect to trying to segregate out what are lakes versus wetlands.
Eugenie, is there anything you want to add to that in terms of a gap vis-a-vis the conversations we were having in Finland on this?
Well, I think you're talking about the conversations we had about figuring out the representativeness of where the flux towers are located versus how the landscape is actually how the landscape is actually divided. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there is that effort that is ongoing in terms of. So we have all these flux towers out there, and they're collecting these data from these different community types. But how representative are they in terms of the overall Arctic landscape, and how can we map that, and where are the gaps in terms of maybe where we might want to think about making additional measurements that might be important to make in terms of understanding underrepresented ecosystems. And I think, let's see, I think Matthias Gedke at MPI is working on that a bit. He's been in communication with me a little bit and some others about figuring out where all the flux towers are located, and then doing a pan-Arctic map of where they are, and then where we might want some in the future. I do think, in terms of thinking about maybe more measurements that we might want to make, one thing that we're currently lacking, at least on the North Slope of Alaska, maybe not in Siberia or Canada actually, is a very tall tower, like a tower that's several hundred meters tall, and that could be that could actually serve as an integrator over the larger region, because the tall towers are capable of seeing. Essentially, if you had about a 300-meter tower, you could see most of the North Slope from that tower, and it would be covering all these different ecosystems, and it would complement nicely the aircraft measurements.
Yeah, this is Dave McGuire. I might add that.
Go ahead, Dave.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to add it. I mean, that's a really good point that Eugenie made, and that it was also something that was called out in the the Search IPY plan back that we put together back in 2005, and it's still something, but I'm sure Chip can add to the discussion on the value of it.
Yeah, so I was going to say that there was a nice study led by Doug Worthy as part of the 2015 AMAP report that looked at the location and number and distribution of towers around the Arctic. And they didn't get all of them, but in what they were showing, they came to the conclusion that the network was too sparse to answer some of the key questions that were being posed at the time, such as whether or not there was a large East Siberian shelf methane emission, whether or not there were long-term trends in specific regions of the Arctic, et cetera, because again, in space and time, the network is too sparse. I completely agree with Eugenie that towers on the North Slope would be incredibly valuable, and I use the plural because we have done some of these studies, and you would want, I think, at a minimum, 2 towers up, one down in, say, the Toolik Lake area, and another one out in the west, maybe near Atkasuk, to really get good sampling of the entire North Slope. And that would be at a minimum. And so this gets back to Will's earlier question. It kind of depends on what question you want to answer, the design that you would put into an observing system or its components.
Sure, I mean, that's always the stumbling block on observing systems, is you've got to come up with the question you want to ask first. So, fair enough.
So I know we're kind of overrunning time a little bit, but I want to circle back to something, because on July 31st, we are going to be convening the Environmental Intelligence Carbon, what we're calling the Carbon Forum. And here we're going to be drawing together our following the environmental intelligence model, we're going to draw together the observing and the data and the modeling teams. And the purpose of doing that is both to sort of, identify the issues that lie between the communities that are interested in the modeling and the observing and the data management, which I think some of this work touched upon already. But one of the questions that I had, and I think maybe Dave's presentation with the search work touched on it a bit, is what do you feel are really the critical decision support questions that this kind of wrapping your arms around the Arctic carbon budget really seeks to understand? There were some pieces about fish and wildlife. I think the infrastructure pieces are more the sort of structural aspects of permafrost. Just kind of kicking it out to the group. What are the big decision questions that this work can inform?
Well, let me throw Ted a softball, and just say
go ahead,
that you can imagine the worst case scenario that you've got a set of natural processes that would completely undermine the Paris Accord.
Yeah, so Sandy, were you speaking specifically in the context of the carbon cycle? Because I think, what Chip just said, that's the big question.
That's the big one.
How much additional carbon, as both carbon dioxide and methane, are we looking at? And I think it's observing in terms of present state of the system. Has, like Chip said, has this changed since the 1980s to the present? And then what are envelopes of future projections that you can give to the large Earth system model to both calculate kind of climate impacts, and then people have been doing with integrated assessment models the dollar amount. So I think in terms of that community of decision makers, that's what we're looking at. And I guess for that conversation, I would set infrastructure and then these local ecosystem services. That's kind of a separate group of decision makers that are thinking about, impacts in the Arctic.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of global impacts versus the carbon cycle versus local impacts.
Yeah. So, I thank you for the overviews, and, I think that the global question is usually the more obvious one. I am curious about the local ecosystem question as well, because I don't know that we have those people engaged for the conversation that we're planning at the end of the month. And I just noted it when you were showing the permafrost carbon team work under search, that it looks like you have maybe done some engagement there.
So search, just kind of drifting off carbon for a minute, search does have a broader scope, and maybe in that sense, for the permafrost action team, it's thinking about mostly the land system, so not your integrated with oceans. But we are thinking about the local impacts, and we haven't done as much thinking about all the players, but we're going down the road of developing sort of frameworks to think about impacts of degrading permafrost in basically the built environment, human infrastructure, and then the natural environment, but again, through the lens of ecosystem services. So what are ecosystems providing to society? And the way that we're doing that with search is a figure that McGuire showed on these knowledge pyramids. So we're trying to assemble information that end with these high-level briefs, thinking about who wants to know and what are the key questions they want to know about, and kind of organizing information that way. So I'd be happy to share more of that offline about the details of what we're doing to organize there, but we're kind of trying to be more comprehensive under the search umbrella than just the carbon question that the Permafrost Carbon Network has been engaged with. Okay.
Yeah, if there's anybody on that local impacts ecosystem services side that would be a valuable voice to bring to the table, or maybe it's more than one person to bring to the table, the corollary and ocean science side being the, you know, carbon and the ocean acidification and the impacts on ecosystems there. And so I was just wondering if there's somebody from the terrestrial or some groups of people from the terrestrial side that are concerned about excess carbon in the terrestrial ecosystem that we should be including in that discussion.
Yeah, sorry, you mentioned carbon. Were you, are you thinking carbon or non-carbon? Maybe I lost track of what you just asked there.
Yeah, maybe I'll follow up with an email. I don't think it's clear right now.
Yeah, that's fine. We don't have to, we can, but sure, we can help kind of get that group together.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this was a really great discussion. I think one of the best that I've experienced since joining IARPIC. So thank you all for participating. I think we have some really good notes and things to move forward with the environmental intelligence carbon focus and things to think about. So with that, we'll conclude the call for today, unless anyone else has any updates or things that they want to add in.
No, I would just thank everybody for the extra time. Often these
thank you.
calls are just sort of, you know, the presentations, and then you get to the top of the hour or the end of the hour, and that's it. So, I mean, I'm sure we could talk about this a lot more, and we won't. But I appreciate the conversation that went on afterwards. Was, I think, particularly good.
Yeah, and I just would add again the plug for the discussion that's going to take place on the 31st. It is our intention within the IARPIC space to try to keep propelling the carbon topic, maybe every other month, every third month, to try to build on this discussion. So if you have some ideas about some of the things that we touched upon that we could maybe do a deeper dive on at a subsequent discussion, that would be quite valuable. We also are on the hook to do some kind of summary about this discussion for the 31st. And I think just it's a longer format meeting, and it's going to involve people from the modeling community and the data community. And we are going to be thinking about some of these decision support issues related to Arctic carbon. So I really encourage everybody to join for that.
Yep. Yeah, okay. Good. All right. Well, thanks everybody, and Cindy and I will be in touch with each other, and Emily, and we'll put the notes together, and then we'll think about continuing this conversation over the next few months to beyond the 31st.
Sounds great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone.